Welcome to A-Push. I'm going to warn you, there's a lot on this slide, but I'm going to try to go through most of it relatively quickly because most of it should be review from world history and then just hit on the American parts that are relevant to our discussion going forward. So here are your major objectives. Take a moment to make sure you can remember these things from world history, and then let's dive in. So, the Enlightenment was a changing of the way people thought about the world. You remember this from world history, Age of Reason, blah blah blah, looking to actual observations about the world in order to draw conclusions, as opposed to looking back to sources of tradition, things like that, right? Bringing back the Socratic method and challenging all of the preconceived notions about society, building off of the Renaissance, all this stuff. Anyway, so political philosophers, here are the ones that you need to know. Again, totally review from world history, so you should know these guys already. So, Thomas Hobbes believed in a strong central government, wrote the book Leviathan, believed humans were evil, and therefore they needed to be controlled by a strong king who would prevent them from killing each other. Life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Voltaire argued for freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and pushing back against old sources of tradition. So he's a philosopher in that the idea of freedom of speech comes from him. And so we get a lot of the different pieces that eventually went into the American Constitution from these Enlightenment philosophers. Then you've got John Locke. He, of course, came up with the idea of the social contract, or was one of the people who articulated a social contract, that the government has responsibilities to people, and that people give power to the government, and the government protects the rights of people. And then, of course, if the government misuses the power, the people have the right to replace and overthrow it. We're going to get into a lot of Americans quoting John Locke here relatively shortly. He also believed in this idea of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, which hopefully sounds somewhat familiar because it was paraphrased/plagiarized by one of the founding fathers. No spoilers, we'll get into that later. And you've got the Baron de Montesquieu, who came up with the idea of separation of powers. Hopefully that also sounds familiar. It's the idea that you spread that power out in order to prevent tyranny from rising. And so Montesquieu represents that whole separation of powers. Then, of course, are my favorite, the economic philosophers. Hopefully you remember that before this whole era, we had this thing called feudalism with sort of a strict lord-vassal relationship defining most people's lives. After the fall of the Roman Empire, power became hyper-local, and then eventually kings rose up. And anyway, we're not going to get into feudalism. It's a series of social contracts between a variety of different people, and not super efficient for bringing in new ideas and stuff like that. So instead, we get guys like Thomas Munn, who articulated this idea of a favorable balance of trade, that rather than producing your wealth through farming, maybe you should be manufacturing goods and then trading them, especially to colonies, in order to make a profit. We talked about mercantilism yesterday, and hopefully you can recognize some of the flaws with this theory, because, of course, regulated trade, if you're regulating trade heavily, you're going to be leaving money on the table at some point. So, eventually, criticizing this philosophy, we get Adam Smith, and Turgot and the physiocrats and all those guys, but mostly Adam Smith, who came up with this idea of free markets and supply and demand. The idea that rather than trying to regulate prices or trying to regulate trade, markets will naturally regulate trade, as people will pay for things what they think they're worth and sell them for what they think they're worth. And that negotiation eventually brings us to an equilibrium price where everyone is getting what they want for the price that they're willing to pay for it. And everyone is able to sell what they want for the price that they're willing to accept. This is the idea of the invisible hand eventually creating a fair market price. So, Adam Smith, we give him credit for the creation of classical economics. And of course, these ideas are central to this thing called capitalism, which you are hopefully familiar with. So that gets us through all the European, or most of the European developments. Of course, the scientific revolution was happening in Europe, and so I'm not going to go into Galileo and Francis Bacon and all these guys. Just understand that our American scientists benefited from the things that Europeans have been doing for a while. And so that brings us to inoculation, which a cure or a treatment for smallpox was developed here by Cotton Mather. He was a doctor in Massachusetts, and he came up with this idea that by giving someone a small amount of this of an inert part of a piece of the virus, they could develop an immune response. And so he quickly began to inoculate people for smallpox, and smallpox was more or less wiped out of New England society because of the works of this doctor. So inoculation. And then Benjamin Franklin is, of course, our famous polymath. Benjamin Franklin was a native of Pennsylvania, and he, after failing as a printer, became an inventor and got into more or less everything, inventing, a new type of stove and the bifocals and lightning rods and wooden fins, which looks super fun. And of course, also became an important politician, and then eventually the publisher of Poor Richard's Almanac, which was one of the more well-read publications in the colonies. So Benjamin Franklin got into just about everything. Last piece that we need to connect to this is the First Great Awakening. So all of these new ideas were flowing into the colonies and challenging previous sources of tradition. The same way that this was a fact. The Enlightenment brought changes to many different ways of thinking. And of course, there was lots of pushback to these ideas. The Enlightenment focused on this idea of reason, whereas religious groups pushed back, arguing that it was emotion and feeling that was more important than reason. And so, as we always do, we get this sort of tug and this sort of give and take between forces of reason and forces of emotion. And so the First Great Awakening started in Europe, and it was a movement to focus on feelings to get back to traditional religious practices. These European preachers eventually traveled to America, most famously George Whitefield and then John Edwards became two of the most famous of these preachers. They would travel around the colonies, George Whitefield mostly traveling around the southern colonies, and John Edwards traveling around the northern colonies, preaching to massive open-air audiences, arguing that it was individual experience and emotion that was more important than traditional religious practices or liturgy or, rituals, stuff like that. John Edwards specifically had this very hypnotic speaking style where he would basically deliver these sermons in a monotone. And as hopefully you remember from reading Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, would remind you how much God hated you and that you were going to hell. These beliefs were very popular among some groups and were very unpopular amongst other groups. So, of course, they're preaching equality, which makes the elites of society relatively unhappy. They're preaching greater religious excitement, which makes the established clergy unhappy. And it's encouraging the colonists to be independent thinkers, which, again, people in authority don't particularly appreciate independent thought most of the time. So the result was it created splits within congregations and within the colonies as a whole. The new lights, in general, appreciated these new developments, whereas the old lights did not. And so this led to schisms within churches and the formation of a lot of new churches and a greater diversity of religious thought. So the First Great Awakening encouraged individual expression and created a more diverse religious community within the colonies. So here are your objectives for today. Hopefully you can go through and briefly review these Enlightenment thinkers. I apologize it was so quick, but you should be familiar with these guys already. And then when we come back, we'll start talking about social class and American society and some of the conflicts that are leading up to the end of the colonial era.